This is Never Close the Inquiry with Nick Hagan. Welcome to Never Close the Inquiry, where I aim to demystify the right for the left and the left for the right. Where if you come as a conservative, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about liberals. If you come as a liberal, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about conservatives. With the whole idea that over time we'll create better conversations, better relationships, better arguments, and maybe 80 or 90 more steps down the road, a better country. Welcome back to Never Close the Inquiry. I'm your host, Nick Hagan. Today's episode, by the way, it's kind of funny. I am filming some of these intros, recording these intros back to back. So if you're watching this, you'll note that I am wearing the same sweater that I'm wearing in a couple of other episodes. Anyway, today it's a big one. We got another interview, this time with Professor Mehrsa Baradaran, who is a professor of law at University of California, Irvine, and a noted authority on banking law. I interviewed Professor Baradaran about her latest book, The Quiet Coup, Neoliberalism and the Looting of America. This interview was such a treat. Professor Baradaran is absolutely brilliant. She is a dynamo, and it was especially fun doing this interview on the heels of doing the interview with Professor George, who is very much on a different part of the political spectrum, of the ideological spectrum. They have very different focuses in terms of their scholarship, but Professor George is very much a conservative, and Professor Baradaran is very much a progressive, um, definitely a capitalist. She made sure to affirm that multiple times and does so in the book. But she is absolutely a progressive and someone whose ideas are going to be very challenging to people with economically conservative views, which I think means that if you are a conservative, you should make a special effort to listen to this one. And then if you want to comfort yourself after, maybe you can go back to Dr. George. Anyway, I want to read from the book jacket to kind of give you an intro as to what the book is about, what our conversation is about. And I think it's also worth noting that many of the problems that Professor Baradaran points out in her book, they are problems that are seen not just by the left, but also by the right. Each side has different solutions, but this idea, these anti-establishment movements, they're there on both sides. Obviously, President Trump came in as the leader of an anti-establishment movement. There is a lot of distrust in institutions on the right and on the left too. Obviously with Senator Bernie Sanders with his runs in 2016 and 2020, that those impulses are there on the left too. I think it is probably fair to say that in the last election, in certain respects, the uh, the Harris campaign was associated more with the establishment. The Trump campaign was associated more, with these populist anti-establishment movements. But the I think both sides, to a great degree, are seeing some of the same problems. So let me read this from the book jacket as an intro. With the nation lurching from one crisis to the next, many Americans believe that something fundamental has gone wrong. See, I think that's true on both sides. Why? That's not written there. I said that. Why aren't college graduates able to achieve financial security? Why is government completely inept in the face of natural disasters? Believe it or not, she wrote this before the California fires. And why do pundits tell us that the economy is strong even though the majority of Americans can barely make ends meet? In The Quiet Coup, Mehrsa Baradaran, one of our leading public intellectuals, argues that the system is in fact rigged toward the powerful, though it wasn't the work of evil puppet masters behind the curtain. Rather, the rigging was carried out by hundreds of mostly law-abiding lawyers, like me, judges, regulators, policymakers, and lobbyists. Adherents of a market-centered doctrine called neoliberalism, these individuals, over the course of decades, worked to transform the nation and succeeded. Tracing this largely unknown history from the late 1960s to the present, Baradaran demonstrates that far from yielding fewer laws and regulations, neoliberalism has in fact always meant more and more complex laws. Those laws have uniformly benefited the wealthy. From the work of a young Alan Greenspan in creating black capitalism to Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell's efforts. So, Lewis Powell, I think the only UVA grad to serve on the court, but anyway, to that's where I went, in case you don't have that context. Efforts to unshackle big money donors to the establishment of the law and economics approach to legal interpretation, Baradaran narrates the key moments in the slow-moving coup that is neoliberalism. Shifting our focus away from presidents and national policy, she tells the story of how this nation's laws came to favor the few against the many, threatening the integrity of the market and the state. Some have claimed that the neoliberal era is behind us, but Baradaran shows that such thinking is misguided. Neoliberalism is a failed economic idea. It doesn't, in fact, create more wealth or more freedom. But it has been successful, nevertheless, by seizing the courts and enabling our age of crypto fraud, financial instability, and accelerating inequality. An original account of the forces that have brought us to this dangerous moment in American history, the Quiet Coup reshapes our understanding of the recent past and lights a path toward a better future. It's a great book. I think you should pick it up and read it and engage with the arguments that are in it. It is not going to be, I think, probably, fully convincing to every conservative that reads it. That's totally fine. I think it's still important to engage with these arguments. One thing that was fun in our conversation, I'll say this last thing before I let you actually get to her. She's a lot smarter than me. She and I both worked as lawyers on Wall Street. You know what by the way, that's kind of a metaphorical thing. That's figurative. Wall Street, figurative. There are very few firms and banks still on actual Wall Street. Anyway, we were both at major Wall Street firms. She was doing banking law, and then she became an academic writing about banking law. She actually knows in a practical sense, a lot of what she's talking about, because she actually worked on these transactions, and when I talk about bankruptcy, I'm able to speak with a little more specificity than I can on other things because I actually was a corporate bankruptcy lawyer. What that should tell you is that even if you think we're wrong to see some of these problems, and I was surprised talking to Professor Baradaran, because I would not call myself a progressive necessarily. I was surprised talking to her how much I agreed with her, or how much she sees problems, and I, based on my experience, think, you know what, that maybe is a problem. Solutions, those are pretty hard. So we'll have to figure that out. But whatever side you're coming from, listen to it, enjoy it, engage with the arguments, and hopefully you enjoy as much as I did. And now, Professor Baradaran. Okay, so Professor Mehrsa Baradaran,
Perfect.
you're here to talk about your recent book, Quiet Coup.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and we can bridge off of that. We're in a very interesting time in America's history.
Mm-hmm.
Let's kind of get into it. First off,
Mm-hmm.
I would love to hear a little bit about your personal background,
Mm-hmm.
like what brought you to this point, what brought you to the point of being interested in the topics that are covered in the book, what
Mm-hmm.
brought you to those viewpoints that are articulated in the book. And the reason I want to hear that is because with the audience being kind of bifurcated, there are people that listen to this or will listen to this on both the right and the left.
Mm-hmm.
And I want them, so the people that are accepting your ideas or rejecting them, I want to understand not just what they're rejecting, but whom. And so I think it'd be helpful to get a little bit about your background.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to answer in sort of a mystical way, because I think there's like oh, well, this led me to this, and then this led me, the like academic way is like, I'm a banking regulatory specialty. That's my specialty. I was on Wall Street, did that. And so
Mm-hmm.
my articles in academia before tenure, let's say, I was all just straight banking regulation. That's what I research. That's what I study. I'm obsessed with it. Like just Glass-Steagall Act and Dodd-Frank, all that, just banking regulatory stuff, but really the nuts and bolts of that system. So my first book that I wrote was How the Other Half Banks. And it was really
Right.
just connecting, here's a payday lending. I was looking at payday lending and usury and all the debt of, poor people versus the mainstream banking sector, and kind of just showing the differences in those systems and really how it is that some poor people just got left out of the banking sector. So that was the first book. And that book took me kind of circuitously to looking at these, history of these banks. I had never heard there were all these immigrant banks and these Black-owned banks. And so that kind of stood out to me from the research of the first book. And so the second book, I started as an article, and as they all start, and then it really just blossomed out from there. I ended up spending months in the Nixon archives, just chasing kind of the ideas. And then from there, the last book kind of ended with me in the Nixon era, just really fascinated with how this churn in American politics happened. And I kind of place it in the Nixon administration. A lot changed then, especially in the way we see corporations and the way we see banks and the way that we see laws. And so I started there, and I wrote, I think, an op-ed at some point about neoliberalism and the looting of America in the New York Times. And an editor called me and he said, I would like to turn this into a book. And so I worked on that, and that book was very difficult. It took, most of my books take a couple of years. You know where you're going, you get there. I'm always surprised by the book that emerges rather than the book I set out to write. And each time I would say the book that emerges gets further from the book I set out to write. And this one was the furthest. And in that way, I think this is where this book, I realized at the end is like, oh, am I writing I thought I was writing a story about neoliberalism and Nixon and putting all the parts together. It was just that vast and massive book. It's like 10 chapters. I had to read a lot for it. I mean, I really put a lot in this book. And I realized toward the end, am I writing about why did what happened to me and my family happen to me and my family in the 1970s in Iran? That kind of emerged as, have I all this time been doing research, which is sort of the like not an admission you want to make as a researcher, because you want to keep yourself objective. But what I realized, I guess this is the mysticism of it, is that I've always been in the ghost behind the research agenda. And it really led me to look at the geopolitical landscape around the 70s in money, in finance, and how it was. I was born in 1978 during the Iranian Revolution, and I can very much now see exactly what happened in the West and in the Middle East to lead to the circumstances that made it such that my childhood was under, men with guns and like straight fascism, really. Of the Islamic variety, but no different from the other fascisms in history, where there's a corrupt regime, the pent-up rage and anger, and then some group from the right comes in and says, we will fix it. And the way we're going to fix it is by killing a whole bunch of people and dissidents, and really just launching us into war and kicking out minorities and really closing off Iran from the rest of the world. That's what happened in 1978, is ongoing. That's what am I, 46 years later, they're still in control. And so that was the thing that exiled my family. And so I think, and the book is not about that, but I do believe that neoliberalism and some of the forces that I talk about have really not just shaped the world politics, but have brought what I see is a sort of turn against the world, like openness in our politics. It's this real shutting down as a solution to a problem. And what I try to do in the book is just to highlight the problem. There is a problem. There's a problem in the global political system and the global monetary system. And I don't think the solutions on offer right now are the answers.
That is a fantastic intro. So 3 questions that come right out of that. First, what would your definition of neoliberalism be?
Right. This is the hardest thing about the book, because there's like what the neoliberals themselves said they were. So this is Milton Friedman's article in 1951, Neoliberalism, and it's something like, and the law or whatever.
Yeah.
Now it's something neoliberal. Anyway.
Yeah. It has a name. Yeah.
Yeah. So he says that neoliberalism is a return to sort of Adam Smith and free market principles, less government intervention and more, free markets, right? Whatever that means. I think to him it means like less regulation, less state, less Keynes, more Hayek, sort of like as an economic principle. There's what it says it is, and I think a lot of people on the right and left would say that neoliberalism is still that, especially on the left, right?
Yeah. Can I actually read 4 things that stuck out from his article, just because I think a lot of people on the right will not okay, so some of it they'll recognize, some of it they won't. So he does talk about minimizing regulation. He says explicitly to minimize barriers to entry. It's all about facilitating competition. That's why you get rid of the regulation. And then he speaks in favor of vigorous enforcement of antitrust laws. That point we had Sherman and Clay. Like, he talks about vigorous enforcement to prevent monopolies, to, again, facilitate competition. It says no industry-specific subsidies. We obviously have quite a lot of that. And then he also says no minimum wage. And a lot of people now would say that, but he says that at the same time that he says you do need minimum income. He's talking about UBI.
Oh, he's talking about UBI. Yeah, Friedman
Yeah.
is not what people think he is. He was very, and he was also talking about heavy state power and enacting all
Right.
these things. Right.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's what Friedman says it is. But really, when you look at what neoliberalism says and then what it does, there's a real mismatch, because what it does
Hmm.
is actually not less regulation. It's a lot more regulation. It's a lot more administrative power. Just that now we have the industry sort of working with the regulators. There's all sorts of
Yeah.
stuff that happens, and I go catalog it in the book. I make kind of a couple claims about neoliberalism, and I'm mostly, first I'm kind of trying to argue against the people who have defined neoliberalism thus far. One, as an economic agenda. Two, as just this is economics. Two, that it kind of started in the Reagan Thatcher era. That's like the height of neoliberalism, say many on the left who are critics of it.
Hmm.
And three, that the answer to neoliberalism is like anti-capitalism, is to be more, redistributive, or Keynesianism, right?
Right.
So I make 3 points on that. One, it wasn't economics, it was law. Neoliberalism really comes in and completely redoes the administrative state. So it's not less law, it's more law, but just more corporate friendly law. So a more capital unleashing law. But it's still law. Anything that we're talking
Right.
about in the market is law made. You don't have a market without these laws that design. And two is that it doesn't start in the Reagan administration, but in the Nixon administration. And its impetus is not, an economic impetus. It is really a worldwide interregnum after empire, which is that the empires lost their sort of alibi after the Nazis take, their racial supremacy and take it on Europe. The empires, the 5 European nations that controlled every nation basically in the global south, and their resources had done it based on, basically, we're like a higher race and we get to take your stuff, basically.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
that went away. And so, but the motive, the alibi went away, the motive did not. And the motive had always been getting, oil, copper, diamonds without paying market rate for it. Okay. So
Hmm.
how do you keep your corporate tentacles and profit making machine going in an extractive system without using racism as the justification, and just straight out like empire? You can no longer, based on the Geneva Conventions and UN, do these wars just to take other people's land.
Right.
So in that interregnum, the global South countries basically fight for sovereignty. They say, we want, you all did trade protectionism. You all protected your nascent industries for 100 years. We want to do that. We want to take our copper. We want to take our oil, and we want to grow our economies to be able to compete with yours. And, the first nation that does that is actually Iran. Mossadegh says, you can compete for our oil, you can pay market price. And he says this to the British, who had come in 1910, and they wanted Iranian oil, and they got it for like $1 a ton based on this contract that they did in 1910, a contract that they enforced through bombing. So every time the Iranians tried to get out of it, they bombed parliament, right? And Iran is an
Smart.
interesting nation because it was never colonized directly.
Hmm.
But it was a vassal state in this way. So it was just
Okay.
oil that they wanted. So when Mossadegh in 1953 says, you can buy our oil, but you can't have it anymore, the British convinced the CIA to do a coup and take him out, basically, Mossadegh. And so at that point, they bring in the Shah and they put him in. And this happens after that across the world.
Hmm.
So they bring in the Shah, and he gives them oil, and he gets weapons and money, and then he like shuts down any dissent. And that is the pressure that then boils and boils and boils for 30 years that leads to this Islamic revolution in the 1970s.
Hmm.
So that happens writ large across the colonies. And by 1970, you have a totally different world order, which is, we're still getting copper from Chile and oil from Iran and other, but it's through sovereign debt, it's through IMF loans, it's through this world trade system that really is still about empire, but it looks and acts and feels a little bit different. And the rhetoric of this is no longer racial hierarchy or divine right as it used to be before. Now it's like, it's free markets. So this is that we are, it's the cover, which that's what I'm trying to look behind the covers, like it was no such thing as free markets. It wasn't a free market. A free
Right.
market would be that everyone would get to bring their items to trade, to global trade, and get equal treatment.
Hmm.
So that's the second. And then the third, I guess, point here is that what it did do wasn't at all a free market. It just made corporate interests and government interests that much tied in together. And talk about industry specific subsidies, as Milton Friedman, it was really three industries that led the charge on the neoliberal, right wing backlash. Was, and it wasn't just right wing, it was everybody was in on it, but it
Yeah.
was oil and gas, weapons,
Mm.
and tobacco at the time that were
Hmm.
really like the end of an era. And these particular industries started creating these think tanks that pushed their specific agenda, and their specific agenda was essentially like leave us alone, and that just ballooned into a whole legal takeover that changed the court system, changed the legal system completely.
Yeah.
That's what I trace in the book.
Oh, man. Yeah. Okay. So that is really interesting. So to take a brief step back. Okay. So that's kind of, yeah, that's what you do in the book. That's how it ended. What did, when you started writing it, when you started doing the research, what did you think you were writing? If it wasn't that.
I thought I was writing a narrow, neoliberalism is law. So if you read chapters like 4, 5, and 6, something
Mm.
around, like those were the chapters that I probably had written early on,
Yeah.
but, for those who haven't read it, you know, it got much more international than I intended. It got just bigger and more. I had to bring in more. I talk about crypto in the end. I talk about just, I had to explain capital toward the
Yeah.
end, because I would say the book is divided up into three parts. It's like
Yeah.
how did neoliberalism get started? Like, what is a historical background? What motivated these guys? And then what is it?
Hmm.
In the middle of the book is like, what did it do? Just like, here's the law, here's what it did to contracts, here's what it did to markets and government, and then what did it create? And there was, it just got more, it's more bigger picture. Like, what is capital? What does it mean when you unleash capital from all restraints? What is capital itself, right? It's this growing idea. And I say in the book, I tried to use like different analogies. It's like a
Hmm.
virus, it's a cancer, it's a meme, it's a thing that has to grow. And when you don't limit its growth anymore, it grows at such a fast rate that it ends up coming back in to really shape the economy to its own ends, to
Yeah.
capital's own ends. So,
Yeah.
we worry about this AI takeover. And my conclusion here is like, we've been taken over by an artificial intelligence, and that is capital's need for yield year after year, at least 6%, up to 20% at any cost, right? So
Yeah.
that I think is a fundamental reshaping. So it's not just a free market. We have a financialized economy. And what does it mean when finance runs the ship? It's not production, it's not jobs it cares about, it's just yield. And we've been in there since the 90s. It got supercharged in the 2010s, and it's now just buried away from public sight because it's really in these very complex Fed programs. And I feel incredibly lucky, fated, that I got a firsthand seat into this. I was right there in 2005 to 2010. I was at the only banking law firm on Wall Street. Our clients were the New York Fed, the Fed, and all the banks. And I was just right there, and I got to see inside this obscure, esoteric, controversy laden machine and see what it is. And it really isn't the controversy. It's not a conspiracy. It's just it's money leading. It's an idea. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I want to ask. Let's try and give people that don't have the same familiarity with the specifics a couple of specific examples.
Mhm.
'Cause- So, and just to be clear on the backgrounds, it's like you. So obviously you're a law professor now. You specialize banking law.
Mhm.
You after law school, you were at Davis Polk. Were you at Davis Polk for all 5
Davis
years?
Polk, all 5 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So Davis Polk and Wardwell, one of the nation's great law firms.
Mhm.
I, for the last 6 years until I started doing this, was at Skadden doing corporate
Oh, really? Okay.
bankruptcy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So we both have, I think, some insight into
Yes.
certain parts of what you're talking about.
How that
I would
works.
love to get a couple of specific examples because I actually and I would love to hear you in the introduction to the book talk a little bit about a couple of very famous corporate bankruptcies, but you don't get into corporate bankruptcy law as much
Yeah,
in the book
yeah,
itself.
yeah.
And I would love to hear your thoughts and then provide some of my own, having been on the other side of
Well, yeah. I
some
mean,
big
the first
bankruptcies.
deal I did at the firm was Delta's bankruptcy, on the debtor side, and
Yeah.
what it means. What basically corporations can choose their judge. And Marshall Hubner, who represented Delta, he
Yep.
represented the Sacklers, he represented PG&E. I think also I ended up writing about him in the book.
Yeah.
He was the partner that I worked with. Davis Polk is really, I know this stuff from the inside
Yeah.
level, and what I knew from the Delta bankruptcy, I took to heart is that we got to choose our judge.
Hmm.
We got what the Delta was doing there. It wasn't really exactly bankrupt. It was just trying to get rid of the pensions for the pilots. Really, that was like a planned bankruptcy. There were other things, but the debt restructuring, we got to get rid of a lot of employees that they owed things to, and it was just like these deals. I remember being in the SDNY bankruptcy court the day that the pension, or I was like the secondhand person to the marshal. I was like junior associate, but I was like there with the papers and whatnot. So I got to be in the courtroom every day, and I got to see like the head of the pensions, who was a pilot, like crying on the stand, because he was about to lose his pension, and all the pilots were, because of this bankruptcy. And so when I saw, when
Yeah.
you look at PG&E getting rid of their liabilities, when you look at the Sacklers getting rid of their liabilities, I start the book with PG&E, and just the way that corporations are able to use bankruptcy as a business plan to get rid of, most Americans think that, oh, bankruptcy is like you're ruined, you have nothing. But a corporation is not a real thing, it's an abstract entity, and so they can go to use bankruptcy to restructure and get more debt, but really get out of these liabilities that they owe to people. And that also is a creation of neoliberalism. The bankruptcy code gets a complete redo in 1978, and then there's these judges that you basically, can, like, what, take these seminars and teach them free market fundamentals, and they become very business friendly. And yeah.
Yeah, no, so that's interesting. I want to give people just an idea of the mechanics of how this works, because I'd get a lot of questions about this.
Please say,
People
yeah.
who are not familiar with bankruptcy and do think, okay, so a company goes bankrupt, bye bye company, or something along
Yeah,
those lines. They're thinking of a liquidation. They're
yeah,
thinking of
yeah,
and they're thinking, how can a company that goes bankrupt, be credit worthy going forward? They're thinking
yeah,
of some of the same consequences that would apply in an
yeah,
individual bankruptcy. And so, a couple of things you identified specifically. So, this idea of choosing your judge.
yeah.
So, that is to a significant material degree accurate.
Mhm.
So, the way it works on the law firm side, you we have, and I am going to be delicate in what I say,
Yeah,
because this is
sure.
what I did for the last 6 years, and a
Yeah,
lot of good friends doing this, and I actually do think, and this is maybe to the point of the argument of the book, like, you can look at every
mhm.
part of the bankruptcy code and come up with a pretty reasonable
Totally.
defense,
Yeah,
and and I felt often that what we were doing, we had a stronger moral defense than for that than certainly what some other practice groups were maybe doing, I would
sure.
say.
Yeah,
I'll be somewhat less delicate
yeah.
talking about other practice groups. But so we before every case, we would do a some research on venue.
Mhm.
And we would go issue by issue, anything that could affect our client. We would know the treatment for that in the Fifth Circuit, in the Second
Yeah,
Circuit. We're looking, and the Third Circuit, because we're the three most used bankruptcy courts in the country are SDNY, Southern District of New York,
yep,
District of Delaware, and Southern District of Texas. Texas has come up in the last few years, obviously
yep,
because of oil and gas.
yep,
There's a lot that I think Americans don't necessarily understand about oil and gas, but because of the cost of extraction in the United States,
yeah,
anytime the price drops, there's a whole flood of
yeah,
American companies that go bankrupt, and they pretty much all do it in the Southern District of
yeah,
Texas. Anyway, so you're looking at those, and you have all these different, esoteric, specific legal issues, and we know how they're going to get treated in each one, and we know which ones are particularly important to our clients. And then the different districts are starting to push back on this idea of true judge shopping beyond
yeah,
venue shopping.
yeah,
And so, now it's a little bit more randomized, where, if you're going to the District of Delaware, you get any of the judges,
yeah,
and same thing now in SDNY, which was not always the case.
yeah,
Um, and then this idea of, getting rid of a lot of your liabilities. It's
Mhm.
like, yeah, no, that's true. The priority code,
Yeah.
like, and again, there are justifications for each part of it.
Yeah.
The end result is that you can go in with an enormous amount of debt and then come out with your revenue the same. You are just as strong like economically a company as you were before, but now financially you're much stronger because your debt load
Yeah.
is way
Totally.
smaller.
And it's important that we point this out. There's no bad guys here. Like none of the people I worked with, the corporations, there's no bad guys. Literally everyone that I worked with was just trying to do their job to the best of their ability within the law.
Yeah.
Nobody was trying to break the law. It was just you're trying to do the best for your client. Your client's trying to do the best for their shareholders and their boards. I
Yeah.
teach corporate life. Like everyone's trying to be the most responsible person, and yet that's the point, is that we have a system that goes a certain direction. And when you say, as Milton Friedman did in 1971 in his shareholder supremacy article, is like the only thing, the job of a business is to make profits, not just profits, shareholder profits, right? So shareholders above all other stakeholders. And
Hmm.
and when that becomes the primary driver, and then you add to that the sort of 1990s overlay of it's just profits in Wall Street. So now we're supercharging profits. It's no longer shareholder profits. Now it's private equity profits. And now it's just
Mm.
yields over, so when that's what I mean by, it's really difficult to describe an abstract thing like capital and how it drives every decision and how it comes into the law to really change it, right? So there are these moments of like lobbyists coming in and puncturing holes in the law and allowing for
Hmm.
these things, and then now the cogs in the machine, like us, I was like making derivatives at my firm. I was
Hmm.
doing these like derivatives, and we were talking with the OCC, our counterparty at the bank regulator, and getting these interpretive letters on, can we do this, can we do this, can we do this. And then I step back after the financial crisis and be like, oh, that whole thing that we were doing was the problem. Like the regulators, were asked, like, this is what people are talking about. And I was here, I don't know, you're just doing financial instruments and I don't even think the banks knew. And that's been
Mm.
documented. Like they were doing counterparty trades. It's such a fast paced system. And this is why it's, you know, I start the book talking about the conspiracy theorists and like people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. And, we live in a very complex world. And I think people understand that there's like a basic unfairness to the system, and
Hmm.
that this unfairness is like caused by somebody. That's what I think people's instinct is, because we're human beings who have evolved for many years, or are just in our nature to just look for bad guys, right?
Yeah.
And I think what the truth is that we are, based on these ideologies and based on these systems, it's a system that is working on its own. And yes, there are people at the top who are like, the system does reward greed. And so you're going to get some greed at the very top, and greed that then forges with lawmaking. And but that's also the game that we have. The game that we have is the more money you make, the more laws you can make for your industry, the more successful your business, the more monopoly, right? Because we did stop enforcing antitrust, by the way. So now we've got these monopolies. So if you're a monopoly, you really can write the rules of the game, and under the guise of like it's pro-capitalism, even though
Right.
it's like nothing to do with capitalism when you're talking about monopolies. Read Adam Smith, that was his whole point, right? So that it's a system, and that it's a complex system, right? But it was created at a certain point. That's what the book tries to do, is really show the inputs, like why the system was created, what it
Yeah.
did to the law, and then why it's so hard to see now. It's like, remember the Luigi Mangione, right?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you kill a corporation? Okay. So we all
Right.
understood, like, you just killed a man. They're going to find another human being. But we got that he was upset, whatever. We don't know anything, but we do understand that a lot of people were like, yeah, I was screwed by United Healthcare. And that a corporation can kill people, and a corporation can do harm that
Mm.
feel wrong, but
Hmm.
is totally justifiable from within the corporation. They're just trying to cut costs and make profits and streamline and do all the stuff that corporations are really good at. And the man that he killed was a very good director of that corporation. He was good at his job, right? Did
Hmm.
no more evil than that. looked away probably from some of the things that, structurally, but who wouldn't if you're just working like probably 12 hours a day as he was, right?
Hmm.
Um, so how do you kill a corporation? How do you charge? And people were like, oh, why didn't bankers go to jail? Because it wasn't unlawful what they were doing.
Right.
There weren't
Right.
like, they wanted to see heads, but that's not the system that we have. It could use any of our heads. We were cogs. I worked for the machine. I
Oh
worked.
yeah, yeah.
That's
Let
how I know the things I know.
let me so I have a comment there, and then I have a question. So when we're talking, yeah, we're like, so the whole thing, why didn't more people go to jail? That's come up a lot again with the opioid pandemic. You've had a lot of, or opioid epidemic. Sorry,
Yes.
you've had obviously the Sacklers are the headliners, and there are decent arguments that
Yeah,
what
they're
they
bad
did,
guys. Yeah.
they were not good. They were
They're
not
not
good.
good people. Yeah.
They were not good, but there were a lot of companies that kind
Yeah.
of followed in their
Yes.
footsteps, or profited from some of the bad things the Sacklers did.
Totally.
And
Yeah.
I all this is public, so I can say, I worked the client to which I have billed the most hours was Endo.
Wow. Yeah.
Endo, the manufacturer of Percocet, and they
Yeah.
and Opana ER, which was
Yeah.
a medication that they had some a product, I think is the industry that
Yes.
calls it,
Yeah.
with which they had some more trouble. Um, but the thing is, so they went into
Mhm.
bankruptcy in August of 2022. And there's this perception that it was because of mounting legal liabilities, because
Yeah.
of they're related to opioids, and to an extent that's true, because they were spending a lot um, to to fight these lawsuits
Yeah.
that they could have been spending on R&D, to come
Yeah.
up with new products and everything like that. But it's not exactly right, because I'm trying to think about what all I can say. The understand basically, there is no guarantee they were ever going to lose a case, and I think it's
Yeah.
likely that they never would, because
Yeah.
everything they did
Yeah.
was either clearly within the confines of the law or close enough to it that
Yeah.
they were probably going to
Legal.
win.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like the reason basically they had a completely unrelated drop in revenue that kind of tied their hands,
Yeah.
and so they ended up not in a position to continue paying these legal liabilities. But as to how we get to that point, and man, oh man, I'm gonna get some text messages from people I work with. The
Edit it. Edit this out. Just kidding.
yeah, okay. I want to go to, I believe, the only justice that ever went to my alma mater, UVA,
Yeah.
Lewis Powell.
Oof. Lewis Powell.
And I want to, so I like, obviously some of his opinions I'd read during law school,
Yeah.
and I think I probably knew he's the only one that went to UVA. You never really, kind of who cares, but kind of a fun, like check the
Yeah.
box sort of thing.
Was he the only one? Oh gosh, I didn't know
I
that.
think he
Yeah.
was.
Yeah. I guess they're all like Harvard, Yale. They're very
Yeah, it's like we
collegial.
got a lot of clerks, but
Yeah.
we
Not
yeah,
not justices. Yeah.
not justices.
Well, that's a good one to have. I think he's the most influential Supreme Court justice we've had ever. And
Nice.
underrated as far as his influence. It's a
Yeah.
really interesting guy, right? He gets nominated in his 70s. He says no to Nixon twice because he's a Philip Morris executive, and is
Right.
doing very, very well and has to take a huge pay cut. In fact, his CEO buddies at Philip Morris are there to rope him when he gets inducted into the Supreme Court, whatever he called, you know.
Hmm.
Um, and he is also a Virginian, who's head of the Richmond school board, and during the mass like desegregation efforts, but is not. He's a Southerner, a Southern gentleman who is against integration, but not like a George Wallace. He's not some like out and out racist kind of out there on the streets, but he doesn't think it's a good idea to integrate, right? So
Yeah.
he is able to, through legal means and districting in Richmond, make it so that like 3 kids have to move, schools. He basically leaves the school district intact without having to be all out there saying segregation forever like George Wallace. He
Yeah.
is in charge of Philip Morris's strategy of deflecting the science on cigarettes for years, and getting these lawsuits out because to just cast uncertainty on the fact that smoking is killing people,
Yep.
and that the science is very clear. So he is part of that strategy, and then he is also he writes the Powell Memo, which, you know, I think a lot of liberals see as like the dawn of the neoliberal revolution. I more focus on the Supreme Court record because I think liberals completely miss, you know, who he is, because he wrote Roe and Baki's affirmative action. So
Yeah.
we think, oh, he's this moderate guy. You know, in the memo, he says, you know, American enterprise is under attack. And, you know, this is a Philip Morris CEO saying we're getting under attack and we need to defend ourselves. And he really sets out, either he influences or is very like prophetic in what happens, is exactly what he said should happen, which is that, you know, over time, they should take over the academy, basically create these beachheads and get these articulate defenders of the free market, you know, i.e. Milton Friedman and these guys up there. And they should, the right wing, that the right, or the, not the right, like the pro corporate America should get together and do these think tanks and think long term and think strategically and think about the law and think about defending themselves in the court of public opinion and think about changing these things from the ground up. Really, he's just doing a call to action that is, you know, they're turning, you know, it's very like, he's very alarmist. He's like, the kids are anti-capitalist and you can't go to Yale these days without getting yelled at as a corporation. He's kind of like an old man yelling at the crowds
Yeah.
kind of thing. But really tactically sets this thing up. And then he gets on the Supreme Court, and Nixon, you know, says, look, 2 years with Powell, because he's old, right? So you want to get a young guy. So he gets Rehnquist, and he's not sure about Rehnquist because he's like, this guy's a jackass. I don't know. Like, literally, like the tapes on, if anyone has time, listen to Nixon talking about these Supreme Court choices. He's so funny, so blatant. He's like, do we have an Italian? He's like, well, it's hard to find an honest one these days. Do we have a Pole? I mean, really, like, what about a Catholic? Can we get a Jew? And Nixon's like, no Jews. I mean, it's really crazy, right? They get a woman up there, and he's really happy that the bar says no to this woman because he does not want to elect a woman, does not think that they're qualified. And he gets, you know, and Powell is this perfect choice. You know, Powell says no, but then he says yes. And Powell gets on the court and does several things. So one is the basically overturning Brown versus Board of Ed, but without saying so, to keep the Eastern press thinking that Brown is still intact, but really make it literally impossible to prove segregation. We have more segregated schools than we had back then, but it's not racist anymore. It's like de facto. And the way he does it is to say that economics cannot be a factor here, right? So you cannot say, oh, because you're poor and largely Black, it's because you're poor. Okay, that's why. And so you can have a white school district that has way more money and just all white, and the Black district that has no money in the same zone, but that's not racism because they're not saying whites only. Like, if you want to live there, you can buy a house in this gated community that is $1 million, right? Like things like that.
Yeah.
And then with affirmative action, you know, which started out in the Nixon administration as like a civil rights measure. Okay, fine, you know, whatever. It also started out as a cultural war measure. Like, they knew what they were doing with affirmative action, which is dividing the working class from the minorities. Like, that is like endless fuel for the culture war, is when you have an unfair economy, because, you know, you've got corporate greed, you blame it on minorities who are taking your jobs, that are disappearing. The jobs that no longer exist, you're going to blame minorities. So that he does. And then on the corporate side, Powell does many cases where he really opens up corporate free speech, just corporate speech in general. And then the third pillar is, and which leads to Citizens United. The other side is the Buckley. So he makes it very easy to for politicians to affect laws in these two strands. One is just diminishing the power of legislatures to block, you know, corporate lobbying, and the other is to give corporations free speech rights through lobbying. And he plants these little bombs that really come together and blow up. And meanwhile, his memo has worked to create the Federalist Society and the Law and Economics Network. Those are two things of the neoliberal network that you probably saw in law school, and we don't really see. I think FedSoc has more gotten a reputation of being ideological. It didn't at the time. When I was in law school, it was a little bit, but now it's obviously more because they basically own the Supreme Court. Law and economics does not have that reputation, but
no,
it is
with the FedSoc. Yeah, it's interesting because, I think it's worth noting because I think when people that are not lawyers that haven't gone to law school, when they hear about FedSuck, or maybe when they go to law school but come in and are pretty progressive already, do think of FedSoc as like they're just looking for an excuse to reach a conservative end to some decision,
Yeah.
and maybe, and to some extent, I think that's probably fair, at least some of the time.
Yeah.
But I had I had a great time during law school, and I was a member of a number of different student organizations.
Yeah.
And one of them, and I was, while continuing to be a semi-filthy lib, was an active member of FedSoc for at least a year and a half, I think.
Mhm.
And then it didn't go quite as much near the end. But the thing about what they say, and I think people
Mhm.
should understand this, is that what they're saying is genuinely compelling. Like
Yeah. Totally.
if you look back at it, like the whole idea is like we're gonna look at the text and we're gonna see what they meant then. That's how we're gonna interpret the text. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
that kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
And and this is actually, so
So I'm curious
the
what you
really
thought about my book then. Or that part about FedSoc. I would really
no,
like you.
well, where I get really interested, and I think this is one, is like, so the alternative, and it hasn't caught on nearly as well, but alternative to FedSoc is the American Constitution Society.
Yeah, but that's yeah.
See,
Yeah.
your reaction right there
Yeah.
says a lot.
It's
But it's interesting. I would be interested in your response to, like, why has the left, if we're going to call it the left, why has the left not been able to develop a strong, um, maybe, I don't know if interpretive framework's the right word, but why is there not a left leaning FedSoc that has that same sort
yeah,
of
because
strength?
FedSoc creates the arena of judgment and then it plays on that arena. I mean, it says you need an interpretive tool for the Constitution because, it was realism. And, as I try
Yeah.
to show in chapter 4, like the thing that they're arguing against is like, look, Brown versus Board of Ed overturned a century of law
Yeah.
under no legal principle besides it was wrong
Right.
and it
Yeah.
caused harm.
Yeah.
And that, if you're against that, you want to nail the Constitution to the wall and say, if you're, and really, like, you can't deny that all of this stuff, the originalism, comes from Brown. Like, they are saying this was not in the Constitution. They might as well cite Dred Scott. And I don't think originalists today would say that. Like, there's a lot of originalists who are doing good work. It's not like, these things evolve over time, but the origins of FedSoc come from that moment of reaction to these fundamental changes to society, civil rights, Brown versus Board of Education, and just this idea that the Constitution is you can't change it that fast, right? It shouldn't be evolving. It's not a living Constitution. That's the alternative. And so they create this thing like you need an interpretive method or something, right? Whereas
Mhm.
before that, the Warren Court and previous, you got the Lochner Court, all of these other courts, there wasn't interpretive methods. It was just like, there were ideologies, maybe. There was like legal realism in the Holmes Brandeisian case. There was Lochner in that case. But FedSoc really says, like, you need to debate. Here's the parameters of debate. Now we're all originalists. I mean, Ketanji Brown Jackson, in her swearing in, they're like, "Are you an originalist?" She's like, "We're all originalists." Kagan, we're all originalists.
Yeah.
You
We're
have
all
to be.
textualists or whatever.
We're
Yeah.
all textual. You have to be, and that's FedSoc. They create a litmus test that same with law and economics. When you shift, it's like you shift the arena into like cost benefit analysis or economic efficiency. Um, these are not ideological things. We all love efficiency. We all love, a cost benefit. We all want the Constitution to remain true to its purpose, whatever.
Mhm.
Um, but they're ideologically inflicted in the way that they're approaching these hard, tough questions.
Can I ask you a question? Because I think a common rejoinder would be that if you don't have an interpretive method that is more or less, applicable by someone that's just like, I don't know, that is separate and apart from just like whatever the justice or judge wants.
Yeah.
Like legal realism is going to look different to a judge with personal leanings that are maybe a little bit more left and a judge with leanings that are a little bit more right. So what's the response to that?
Well, the response to that is look at Heller, Stevens' opinion in Heller, where he
Okay.
goes, this is the gun rights case,
Yeah.
where they do, the conservatives do violence to the original text of the Constitution.
Yeah.
So Stevens and Breyer, Kagan has done this. There are many originalist dissents that are like, you are doing with originalism what you're claiming that, so it's not that. It doesn't
Hmm.
hold. If it were, so the charge against the originalist isn't, it's hypocrisy. You're not doing originalism. So really, this is what I mean by we're all originalists. We can play this game too. Like, we can go to the original text and find something in there.
Yeah.
So any interpretive canon is going to have, like, it's false to say that you're not bringing in moral questions and decision making. And I also think that is not justice.
Hmm.
And this is why I go into the morality of, like, that, look at the torture memos, or I had a whole section on the torture memos that I took out.
Yeah.
These are these textualist analyses. One is 80 pages, one is 50 pages. The law that they're describing is a one sentence law that says do not torture. And
Yeah.
what is torture is to inflict harm on people, inflict intentionally harm on somebody. And you read these memos, 80 pages of, like, well, what is intentional? What is the harm? Do you have to intend the harm, or do you have to intend the damage? I mean, truly mind-boggling in its and so you look at that, and then you think about what is law, right? What is law and what is justice? And so what I see as textualism and law and economics, and Posner says this, use efficiency because justice is too hard to get at. Okay, so efficiency is a stand-in, it's a proxy. And I think originalism and textualism, their problem isn't that they're wrong interpretive codes, it's that you're trying to pin the law to something that is not pinnable. In a changing society, a complex society like ours, we need justice and we need morality. We need fairness, and we don't have that. And I don't care what the interpretive text you're saying is, it is not fair. The way
Yeah.
our tax system is not fair. Our justice system is not fair. Okay.
Hmm.
So how do you argue against unfairness? And I see a lot of this stuff as being legally bureaucratic blocks to allowing for justice. And when the law is over here and a felt sense of justice and fairness is over here, and I'm pointing, we're on a podcast, so my fingers are far away. Okay? The law says this, but justice and felt sense say something else. That is where corruption, that is where the seeds of revolution, that is where fascism grows. That is hypocrisy. And hypocrisy has a one-way ratchet, it only grows. That's why you're seeing this distrust of institution. That's why you're seeing the rise of conspiracies. That's why
Yeah.
you're seeing the blaming of all sorts of sectors of our society for what is something that's fundamentally wrong. Because rule of law, I think, is something that people take for granted.
Hmm.
And rule of law is not this permanent thing. It is, you got to try for it. And the founding fathers, the ones who were paying attention, were very, very worried about this. How do you maintain democratic ideals and rule of law in this system that is going to drive toward corruption and hierarchy? We just read Thomas Paine in class the other day, and we are,
Hmm.
Thomas Paine saying it's common sense that you can have 12 guys that have divine right and run all things. We are more unequal than the society that Thomas Paine was complaining about in Great Britain. We have a more unequal society than that of kings. We have just so much wealth concentrated in ever fewer hands, and so much more poverty than we've ever had. Okay, now you can look at yes, if you're poor, you still aren't, like, maybe destitute like you were in a certain
Yeah. Like absolute quality of or standard
absolute
of living. Yeah.
sure,
It's gone
but
up. Yeah.
if you extend that lens to worldwide, it's worse. Okay.
Hmm.
So how do you justify that system? Well, you need ideologies, and this one says, oh, this is capitalism, this is a game that is, you're just bad at capitalism if you're complaining about these billionaires. But it's not capitalism when some kids are born heirs to fortunes that they can never spend. I mean, money grows faster than it can be spent once it gets so large. And then some kids are born without a chance. Like today, the place where a child is born, your zip code determines almost everything about your life outcome. Are there exceptions? A few, sure. And we love to highlight those exceptions. But that American dream, that opportunity society, is not the reality for most people. Look at generationally, right? We've got the boomers that own houses, my generation, Gen X, like, yeah, it's mixed. Millennials, writ large, aren't having kids, aren't married, aren't having houses. I don't think they're making bad decisions. I just think it's gotten harder to buy homes. You said your parents bought a home for 100 something thousand in Salt Lake and now it's $2 million. Who
Something
can
like
buy
that, yeah.
that? Who can buy
So,
that?
it's funny you say that because, uh, I mean, I sit here in a wonderful house. It's at,
Yeah.
nice in New York City. We had a nice apartment. I
Mhm.
sit here in a house. It's rented. It's
Yeah.
like I was at one of the top law firms in the world
Yeah.
for, more than half a decade, and I was paid very well,
Yeah.
and couldn't even
Buy a
get
house and rent.
close.
Could not. You couldn't.
No, not anywhere near where I mean, if you
Buy
want an
$2
hour
million
commute.
dollars? How can you? I mean,
Oh, not even close.
unless you have parents that are willing to give you, $500,000 for a down payment, or if you have
Yeah, I'll talk to
some
him. Yeah.
legacy of wealth, right? Some legacy of wealth. It's gotten harder and harder, and then and that's how you know that's how divine right was. Like, if you're
Yeah.
born rich, you get rich. If you're born middle class, you're real close to the bottom. You got to work
Yeah.
real hard.
So it's interesting. I would. So you said that where you're born, your zip code, determines where you end up. I think I would flip that because I think that will generate some opposition. I think if you say like what I would say, knowing personally some of the conservatives
Yeah.
that are going to listen to this, I would say it predicts it with so much accuracy that you can
Yeah.
functionally say determine.
Fair.
And I think like that's still something that like that's antithetical, I think, to the to this idea of the American dream.
Here's what
And
I'll say. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. I mean, just
no, yeah,
look at, like, you think everyone can see their own headwinds.
yeah,
It's really hard to see your tailwinds.
right, yeah,
Really hard to see. We all work really hard, and we know how hard we work, and we know all these things. But if you look across society, you look at a kid born in a ghetto, you look at a kid born in
yeah,
Detroit, Baltimore, where their schools are falling apart. They have no, like, no social capital in their communities. Are academic words, but they're just very difficult, right? If you look at a, like, all minority school in a very, like, poor county, or even rural white school, right? And you look at how many of those kids go to college versus the military. Are the military recruiting? Where are colleges recruiting? That's why I say zip codes. It's not,
yeah,
black white. It's also just rural,
yeah,
uh, middle class now. And so you could say, well, all those kids are making bad decisions with their lives, and that's the JD Vance thing. It's like they're all drug addicted, and I got out, and why can't they? Or you can say, I think we're often a product of our environment, and if our environment, I know I am, like, yes, I got out, but I also had a family that was, educated and instilled these things, oh, and had enough resources to allow me to go to college and go to law school and all that stuff. I just think it's, you don't want to use privilege writ large, because that's not necessarily what I'm talking about, but it's tailwinds. We have tailwinds, and then there are some people who have headwinds that are stronger than anything. But getting out of personal responsibility, I think, just look at the statistics. Look
yeah,
at look at the wealth on that side. Forget the people, because we just want it to be fair. And if you look at the top 1% now controls. I keep having to update this because it keeps getting bigger and bigger. It used to be like the 1% owns 50% of the wealth. Now it's like 80 to 90%. I mean, in what scenario is that fair to anybody? Do we think that 1% earned 90% of the shares of our economy? And we're talking about, like, stocks and property, and it's getting worse, right? It's
yeah.
getting worse.
So what's interesting is that I think so. You can make the argument, and I think it sticks. That it's fundamentally unfair,
Mhm.
and I think okay, someone says, well, no, let's see, let's look at the absolute level, the quality of life, whatever. That's gotten a lot better. It's like clearly this is not really a problem, and that you know how can you be mad at billionaires that have just done really well in the same system we all live in, whatever. But I think approaching this as a pragmatist, from a realist
Mhm.
perspective, it's like, okay, let's even grant for the sake of argument, and
Mhm.
you don't have to grant this, but let's grant for the sake of argument that fairness and justice are not concerns.
Mhm.
if you still look at a society where that much of the wealth and that much of the wealth is controlled by that percentage of the population, and it's kind of skewed that way, where the more you have, the easier it is to get more
Yes.
and more.
Yes.
It puts us in this situation we're in now, where you have a steady decade over decade decline in institutional trust,
Absolutely.
decline, and like that ends up fundamentally as a problem that, whether or not
Yeah.
like, it needs to be fixed.
It's not, yeah, forget justice and fairness. It's also not profitable.
Right.
It's not, that's what I end up in the book is like, it's not good for the economy,
Yeah.
And, it's, I specialize in finance and banking. It's not good for the economy that all the wealth is being sucked up in private equity, and private equity, the way they're getting yield is like cutting up. They're not creating new things necessarily. They're extracting. It's all finance. It's all finance ate up everything because of this. So I teach contracts, and we're talking about bargaining and all this stuff, but
Yeah.
most of the contracts we sign are contracts that we don't have a say in. Like, we give
Yeah.
our data, we give our whatever. It's not, we don't have a choice anymore.
Right.
And it's these corporations. The corporations are so powerful.
When you get terms and conditions that you buy something, it's not like you're going to send Apple a markup.
What are you going to do? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't agree. It's like, well, don't use our product. That's the answer.
Right.
And it's
Yeah.
gotten more and more, we've lost this is Supreme Court, no arbitration, now it's just arbitration. There's really, I follow this in chapter 6 of the book, is like the reduced right to a jury. You basically lose your right to a jury trial against a corporation.
Yeah.
We've deregulated usury laws, all these laws that try to keep things fair. When you deregulate usury laws, debt keeps climbing and capital keeps climbing, right? We have no limit on how much interest a loan can be, and so that, and societies talk about originalism, like the Constitution, the founding fathers would be appalled at the interest rate, like usury is so fundamental to law. It's like the first law. Look at the Bible, right? Like that, any text, like the usury is because there's an understanding of what money is and how fast it can grow unbound, and how unequal things can get, right? And so that I think is, anyone who has looked at it long enough is like, yeah, don't do usury. Every religion has it. Every religion, every society has it, until 1978, Lewis Powell. Okay.
UVA, baby.
UVA.
Yeah. And the punchline to all of that is that, though there are, I think, sensible policy justifications that you could make for all of those legal changes that have brought this, it is fundamentally a problem that has led to growing and ever-growing anti-establishment movements on both sides of the political aisle.
Yes.
Whether or not they identify the correct villain or whatnot, or whether there is a villain, it's like, people are mad about it.
And I don't think you can call everyone just stupid and uninformed. I think
No.
the left calls the right stupid and uninformed.
Yeah.
And the right calls the left entitled and uninformed. But there's something, and I try to, compare, I'm using analogies here, but I think it's antibodies. It's like antibodies, and maybe they're misdirecting. Look at the crypto. The crypto community is a massive distrust of the financial system. And what is crypto? Right. Bitcoin, but we don't believe in the dollar, and your system's messed up, right? The original Genesis block of Bitcoin had in it the bailout of the banks, which was unfair. The bailout was unfair. Okay. Yeah. Let them fail. Right. So that I think is, you got to look at that. When you look at it writ large, you see, there's a problem and there's solutions, and we don't have to agree on, what exactly we think there's a problem, as long as we can just connect on, this seems unfair to you. I think if we could give a survey to every American and be like, do you feel like the society's fair right now? Do you feel like if you were a baby born, you'd have to word it in a way that got at that, right? No politics. I don't care what your politics are. No buzzwords here. If you're a baby born tomorrow, you don't get to choose where in America you're born, where in the world you're born. Do you think your chances are fair? Right? Do you think that this is a fair society that you're bringing your child into? Do you feel like things are fair? I would say, I don't know how many of us would say no. And we'd have different reasons, right? And I would say, cut off the reasons. Like, no more, we don't need to know that. Just tell me, do you think it's fair or not? And when you have that many people saying it's unfair, that's a problem. And I think they're right. I think they're right. I think they're right. You can't deny people like that feeling.
No.
Yeah, yeah,
Right. So, Marissa, I understand that you
yeah,
have
yeah.
maybe 60 seconds.
Yeah.
If you wanna do just a 60-second conclusion, last thing you wanna leave listeners with, what would you say? Other
Well,
than
I
just
mean,
buy the book, which
yeah,
I
read
will
the
do
book.
that.
I read the book
Yeah.
and disagree if you will, but and I hope that more people focus on this. And I will say, look, an ideology is not I'm a right, I'm a left. An ideology is a belief system that is so pervasive in a society that you don't know you believe it. It's like we look in the history of time and we say, oh, these people believe the craziest things. Or it was like an ideology is so pervasive, you're passing it on, it's embedded in your value system, in the legal system, in the things that we just take for granted. And that, and it's really hard to write about an ideology as it is still pervasive. However, I will say that I think neoliberalism is an ideology that is crumbling. It's just messy. We're not
Mhm.
seeing all its parts yet, but it is crumbling, and more people should be taught. And maybe it's not called neoliberalism, maybe it's called something else. I kind of use that
Crony
sometimes.
capitalism or so
Whatever. Yeah,
yeah.
crony capitalism,
Yeah.
corruption, you might say.
Right, yeah.
Right? Some people would say capitalism. Okay, I don't
Yeah.
think it's capitalism. I don't think
Yeah.
this by any definition of capitalism is capitalism. But a lot of people on the left say this is capitalism. Okay,
Yeah.
and yeah, so I think getting at that could not be more important as it is now, as the enemies of it are really pointing out. I worry about their solutions. I really worry about the pain that is caused, because if you're creating pain and you're deporting people and you're shutting down whatever, and you think it's going to solve it and it doesn't, I worry that the response is more pain. How many more people do we have to shut down, kill off, whatever, to get to the solution? Don't want to get too political, but this is what we saw in Gaza. It's like, if the solution to the violence isn't kill more Gazans, right? I don't think that's the problem to violence, right? You create violence, you get more violence, right? And so if that's not the solution and you do more violence, what happens when the problem isn't fixed? It's just a ratchet up of that. And I worry about a lot of the solutions that I'm seeing right now are ratcheting up solutions. And I was not someone who liked the Democrats at all. I was not going to vote for Joe Biden. Okay.
Huh.
I did vote for Kamala Harris. I wasn't happy about it. I will
Yeah.
say that I wasn't happy about it. I think the Democrats blew their chances to do anything. They did nothing. I was so angry. I was so angry at the Democrats, but angry as in it's just corruption. It's corruption.
Yeah.
They sold themselves. They're hacks. And I will say this.
I no, I part of the reason I love that
Hacks.
is
Yeah.
it's because so we all I will say, and I'll again speak from just direct personal experience. It's like, we have all these big, stimulus packages and whatnot during the pandemic. Everyone's excited, and then we do all the spending. It's very exciting. All I will say is that the biggest year in the history of big law,
Yeah.
major law
Oh,
firms, was
totally.
2021,
Yeah.
and then I think they beat it in 2022.
Yeah. No, no. I was in the Biden administration. I was on the transition team, and we
Yeah,
lost the Treasury to BlackRock early on. That's all I will say.
the boys at
And it's
BlackRock.
in
Yeah,
there. It's in there. I mean, we didn't put up a fight. We didn't put
yeah.
up a fight. We didn't put up a
Huh.
fight. So
Marissa, this has been incredible. Thank you so
thank
much. All right, and that was the interview. Thank you very much for listening. If you wouldn't mind, please do leave a review for the podcast. I believe those are important. And subscribe to the newsletter, which will be linked in the show notes or can be found at neverclosetheinquiry.substack.com. Thanks.